So we've been sharing this information professionally as part of our networking with other housing providers, and we've realised that actually we need to be sharing it with some of our more important stakeholders too, our tenants. So here it is. Not everyone will be bothered by this, but we do feel that it's important to be transparent and to be able to share your views with us. So I'm Rosie Wills, and primarily I'm a social housing professional, but I'm also a chartered construction manager and an ASOC RICS member. I'm going to give you a snapshot of three key projects of many that we've been working on in relation to damp mould and condensation, which from here on out I'll refer to as DMC. These three key projects focus on upskilling teams, meaningful data collection, and environmental monitoring projects, but I'll jump straight into it with an introduction. I'm the Technical Support and Repairs Manager for Devon Housing, and for those of you who don't know, we manage around 3,000 homes. I oversee the repairs and tenancy admin teams, but I also directly manage the responsive repairs operatives, and I get to carry out in-home technical inspections. So some of you may have met me before. One of the first 8 years of my career was actually in community-based health and social care management, and I moved into housing repairs coming up to a decade ago. And I've spent the last few years continuing to learn and be inspired by our tenants and other professionals. And it got me thinking about what I can offer you as part of this presentation. So I'm going to start by explaining the lens through which I've been viewing some of these issues. And a lot of this is influenced by my personal experiences that came well before the professional ones. So I've lived in 17 different homes as an adult, and I've had my fair share of damp and mould. But my first experience with mould was actually as a child, maybe 11 or 12. And at the time, I was living in a rented home, and I ended up treating a small amount of mould, which had started small but built up into this widespread stain. And the point of this story isn't actually about the property condition, but to highlight that at that time, like many of our tenants, my home environment was affected by some things that were out of my control. Debt, fuel poverty, poor mental health, for example. And I don't normally share this so much about my personal history, especially so publicly. So why has it found its way into this presentation? I'm hoping that it gives some credibility to what I'm going to say, and it's not just a paper exercise, but it's something that I've lived and breathed myself. My personal experiences combined with a career in social enabling tells me that despite how sad or shocking some of what we walk into is, jumping in to do things for people or throwing the wrong resources into a situation can look great from the outside, but it can do more harm both in the short and the long term than understanding not just the buildings, but the individual circumstances and working together to find the right solution. So that's me. Let's move on to the next slide and talk about the team. So we've been upskilling the team, and this is an across the board change, not just staff and contractors, but also including and appreciating the knowledge and insight that our tenants have. But I'm going to focus on the two that I think have had the biggest impact. The first is our apprentices. There's an opportunity to embed DMC into the apprenticeship and actively encourage innovation and portfolio work to focus on DMC during the months or the years that they have dedicated to learning and development. We found that people finish their apprenticeships with a specialism and a deep-rooted awareness, just as we've historically had for safeguarding and asbestos. We don't have a dedicated DMC team, it's just become everyone's responsibility. We've been equipping responsive and cyclical repairs operatives with the knowledge and the tools to identify DMC issues outside of their normal sphere of work, and encouraging people to report issues even if it's not the primary purpose of their visit. Our electricians and surveyors are equipped with digital anemometers to properly test extract fans, and the devices also read humidity and temperature. Our trade technicians and multi-skilled operatives carry basic moisture meters, which means that they can test affected areas and tell us if something is dry, in which case we can look at ventilation or heating, or whether further investigation may be needed. We've been supplying mini hygrometers in our tenant mould kit, which is moving more towards a proactive approach. It helps to identify when the mould growth environment becomes present so that we and tenants can act to avoid mould from occurring in the first place. And it helps us to recognise patterns and also identify issues with heating that we might otherwise not have known about. From a technical surveying perspective, we use a multifunction damp meter, which tells us if a surface is dry or possibly not, what the temperature of the surfaces are, what the humidity levels are, and a load of other metrics. It can then calculate a condensation risk for each surface with a red, amber, green colour coding. And what we can do now is show tenants this during inspections because it's quite clear what's on the screen. It's simply colour coded, and we can offer that transparency that we need to build trust. And where actual dampness is identified, we can match against a known moisture profile for various defects, and then can carry out further checks such as drainage surveys, salts analysis, calcium carbide testing, or cavity wall camera checks. So on the top left is a couple of examples. We've got an email from an electrician who previously would have attended to check if a fan was working or not. But now with the anemometer, he can demonstrate exactly how well it is working. So in this case, 72 litres per second roughly, and that the affected wall is dry. But most importantly, he's highlighted some issues with the use of the room. In this case, the curtains were closed, the room was occupied most of the day and night, and the door was shut. So this, combined with a vulnerability flag that we had on our system, led to a face-to-face inspection, and it identified some other issues with self-neglect and hoarding, which prompted a safeguarding referral and some much-needed ongoing support for the tenants. And incidentally, in this case, the mould wasn't a moisture issue at all. So I've invested a lot of time, some of my own time for this, but it's been a crucial part of better understanding our homes and tenants. So this next section is about meaningful data collection. So following on from a smaller project in 2020 to 21, the next phase started with pulling our property data from our asset management database. This is a condensed version, but for example, we looked at the building archetype, heating type and distribution, EPC rating, cavity fill, construction type and year for all properties. To this, we added in details from the repairs history between 2015 and 2023. And then we added data from inspections, voids, independent surveys, new reports, online DMC surveys, and our phone surveys. So by itself, this doesn't mean a lot. It's just a load of raw data. And we could see a few patterns, but it's when we started analysing it that it actually became meaningful. So it enables us to calculate risk for each feature or success rates for each intervention. And this is mostly no surprise to any seasoned surveyor, but it does quantify our anecdotal evidence. It helps us to inform programs, budgets, and use it to inform HHSRS calculations. One of the interesting stats was on mould treatment, which we generally only carry out when there's a building defect. And there's more on this in the 2022 damp and mould review document. But the other key benefit of the data, and probably most importantly, is being able to find and track our silence, which we can do by creating now a focused tenant contact. We can look at, say, the 10% highest risk properties by looking at this data, and we can focus on those rather than trawling through all 3,000 properties. So in our case, we'd be looking at the 1960s bungalows, especially those with electric heating. And this links on quite well to our next slide, which is environmental monitoring. So to set the scene, the majority, perhaps 70% of our DMC cases are resolved by increased ventilation, around 20% or 10% by structural works, and 20% become long-term issues because of overcrowding, hoarding, poor mental health, or other unknown imbalances. This is where the environmental monitoring really comes into its own, and they focus on our hidden causes generally. So the graph on the left shows how seasonal the issues are, because so many relate to condensation mould. They tend to drop right off in the summer, unlike roof leaks or penetrating dampness, which will be an all year round issue. The chart on the right hand side shows that for every one inspection request for damp and mould, there are around 10 reactive or proactive works carried out either by the in-house teams or externally, which either prevent or resolve damp and mould issues. So there's quite a lot going on behind the scenes to make sure that the majority of our homes don't have issues at all, and that those which do are generally resolved as quickly as possible. Getting to roof, gutter and plumbing leaks as soon as possible means that any dampness dries out before it has a chance to turn to mould. On top of this, we have our modernisation contract works, which uses external contractors generally, and this includes new roofing, windows, doors, cavity wall insulation, external painting, and gutter renewal. So although we carry out a lot of repairs and modernisations, not all of these were the underlying cause of mould issues, and our most successful programme of works to date has been the ventilation improvement programme. This has mainly involved, as well as updating our extractor fans or installing new fans, installing positive input ventilation systems. And these work by pulling cool, clean air from the loft or from outside, pushing it through the home, creating a positive air pressure, which then helps stale, stagnant air and moisture-laden air to move back outside through vents, and this dilutes the moisture levels in the air. Research suggests that these systems can reduce airborne moisture by around 10%, But I was a little bit skeptical at first, as there are so many wonder products out there that turn out to be duds. But actually, if you take a look at the graph on the top left, this is one of our properties that we've been monitoring, and we can see from the environmental monitoring in one of these homes that we did actually get that 10% decrease almost instantly. But tenant feedback was our biggest success indicator, and I never expected to see such a massive difference. Around 85% of our tenants who returned the survey said that there'd been at least a significant improvement after having a PIV fitted, and of these, 55% said that it completely resolved their condensation mould issues. Speaking to tenants who told us that they still had significant issues, it became apparent that heating, affordability, and overcrowding were significant factors. So let's get on with the case studies. These are all real properties with the names changed and photos of similar properties. They focus on the same building archetype. And on the next slide, we'll meet the Smith family, who are our tenants for case study 1. So the Smiths live in a 3-bed home in an exposed rural area off the gas network. They've lived in the home for around 11 years and they had a few issues with roof leaks and penetrating dampness in the first couple of years. And these were all resolved, and multiple independent inspections carried out over the years which showed that the works that we did resolve the issues and that there were no new external sources of moisture. The home itself is heated by wood burner, which means that it's quite unstable, sometimes very hot, sometimes very cold, and there's a history of refused heating upgrades. And after a few refusals over the years in relation to ventilation improvements, we were able this year to carry out some ventilation improvements, including a positive input ventilation system. And what we found was that following the installation of the mechanical ventilation, the ventilation improved massively. Carbon dioxide levels, which is what we can see being monitored in the top of this, the top graph, the levels, once the input ventilation system went in, the levels dropped right down to within a healthy zone. Carbon dioxide is generally created by the air that we breathe out, and if it's ventilated out of the home, levels stay in a healthy range. But when the air is trapped inside, it can rise to uncomfortable levels and lead to poor health. You may notice this as the stuffy, stagnant feel or smell of a room first thing in the morning if you don't open a window. Normally 5 to 20 minutes of having a window open will allow this change of air. So for the same case study, and most importantly, the blue circle shows where the positive input ventilation system was installed and how this has impacted upon the damp and mould risk in the upstairs rooms, from high and medium right down to low. So our second case study is Mrs. Jones, and her home had an almost identical presentation to another one that we'd been monitoring, only there was no real explanation for the mould that was up at high level, although there was clearly some environmental imbalance. There was also some very large items of furniture that were touching the external walls, which we regularly provided advice about. Unlike some of the other tenants that we were speaking to that had heating issues, the home always felt warm during our visits. This was a disrepair claim, so some damp-proofing improvement works were carried out to at least rule this out as an issue at low level. These are the interventions that we carried out, but we'll skip through to the next slide. So these major damp-proofing improvement works didn't resolve the mould risk. However, a fortunate combination of the monitoring and communication identified that this tenant was flying abroad once or twice a year in the winter and leaving the heating off completely with no setback. And this was leading to the home dropping to as little as 8 degrees Celsius, despite there being a programmable room thermostat. So the home never really gets a chance to recover from this massive rise in humidity and cooling of the walls and floors. A follow-up visit showed that the furniture is back up against the external walls, and there's a condensation risk on the newly tanked walls, and a real resistance to set up this setback temperature on the heating. But it does at least explain years of otherwise unexplained issues and a practical solution that's available to the tenant. Our third case study is Maple Road. This one was slightly different because we'd learnt a lot more by this point, and we were very confident that it was a severe condensation issue, because even the partition walls had absorbed enough moisture to give a borderline reading. The ventilation was increased to better meet the size of the household, which improved the symptoms to some extent, but the tenants were unconvinced, and understandably, that there was water coming through the floor slab and rising up furniture like you can see in this image. However, We carried out extra tests such as a floor hygrometer that we left on site for 2 days, calcium carbide testing, salts analysis testing, and this all confirmed that there was no rise in dampness and it wasn't rising from the floor. Hygrothermal readings showed high levels of condensation, and this was associated partly with high levels of occupation, but also slightly low heating levels. So I was monitoring this on a daily basis, and I noticed a sudden drop in humidity alongside an increase in temperature. The monitoring doesn't tell us exactly what happened. A change in temperature could relate to a window being closed, the heating being turned on, or additional occupancy. A phone call confirmed that the heating had been increased. So I advised about the positive impact and suggested to increase the heating a little and signposted to financial support, but the heating level stayed the same. But I carried on monitoring over the next 2 months because I was aware of a significant event coming up, and there it was, a sudden and sustained drop in humidity relating to an increase in temperature. I checked the system and I could see that this exactly matched the date of a mutual exchange or a home swap. And I finally managed to get through to the new tenant in March, and they confirmed that they had no issues at all. And just look how that damp and mould risk on the left-hand side plummets with no change in the building itself at all. Even the carpets are the same. And this is a really important point because it shows that it always was a building with no defects. It had an overspec mechanical ventilation system, and although high occupation was a factor, it does go to show that heating was the most significant issue here, and how just a few degrees can make the difference. Our final case study is Anne and Dylan. This one was flagged by a GP who was concerned about the condition of Dylan's room, and I inspected the same week, despite some initial access issues. Anne was very tearful, and she described numerous mental and physical health issues, as well as some terrible family circumstances leading to her grandson Dylan moving in with her. She told me about Dylan's autism and how he wouldn't engage with anyone or let anyone in his room, even her. He wouldn't let anyone in to clean, and food and drinks would be left spilled on the floor. He'd been stung by a bee as a child, and as a result, he wouldn't open his curtains or blinds. And the photos don't do it justice, but my visits to Dylan's room were the worst environment I've been in my life, I think. It was dark, awful air quality, around about 95% humidity, and debris was being blown around the room by a freestanding fan. And it's important to note that the inspection found no building defect, no issues with the heating, and there was no defective ventilation. But I did manage to work with Dylan over the next few weeks and build up some level of trust to be able to do some works. And on the next slide, you can see here as an example that these are two views of the same partition wall. On Anne's side, it's clean and fresh, but on Dylan's, there's a thick mould on all walls and ceilings. But the great thing about the environmental monitoring was being able to see the impact of the interventions that we were able to do after building up that trust. You can see the humidity and the DMC risk dropped just by when I removed the curtains and installed a fly screen. And then further when a positive input ventilation system was introduced directly into the room. On the next slide, you can see that although the air, we can't see, I could tell that the air was still quite stagnant at the time, and the risk remained. After several months, the mould hasn't returned in that room. But another benefit of the long-term monitoring is that we don't tick things off as a complete success just because of one isolated success that we can see. Moving into the winter months, a chronic underheating was identified, and this led to an increased DMC risk in all other rooms apart from Dylan's. We discussed this with Anne, however, she had no concerns and she declined the offer of a programmable thermostat. And I need to be clear that this isn't our normal procedure. We absolutely do not have the resources to treat every damp and mould case like this, stepping in with social care support provision, treating mould, renewing carpets. This was an exception, partly through necessity, partly through being able to use disabled adaptations budget, but also as a demonstration of the resources required for case studies just like this. We couldn't have decanted even if we had a duty to. We couldn't force Dylan to clear his room for access, and there were numerous failed access attempts. So my reflections on this particular case are this. Despite it being flagged as urgent to us by the GP, when we called them back to request support for the medical needs, it took 2 months to get a response back. It took 5 safeguarding referrals and 4 months from my initial visit for safeguarding duty to be accepted, and a further 2 months from there to there being the first visit for social support. Dylan's been making great progress, but unfortunately, Anne has withdrawn from the support. Neither of these are aimed as criticisms of these services. It's just really important to note that this is the nature of the pressure also on primary and social care. And my final point is this. Absolutely, we should never stop trying to improve the response to damp and mould in social housing, and housing providers should absolutely constantly adapt to better understanding the needs of their tenants. But equally, it's really important that we're all able to be honest with each other about the reality of building defects, air quality, financial limitations, and impact of how the home is used and the actual risks associated with mould and mould treatment. In simple terms, I believe that there will be times that condensation related mould will persist in a home, which may be completely out of the landlord's control, but also sometimes the tenants. And we should, however, be able to demonstrate that we've done everything that we should reasonably be expected to do, and also signpost to the appropriate support. So that's the end of my presentation, and I hope you found it a useful insight. And if you feel that this level of transparency is reassuring, please like and share. Thank you for watching, and any feedback at all, please do let us know. If there's any other subjects you think would be useful to cover in more depth, just get in touch.